the CIID Data Integration Toolkit, which you'll hear in much detail moving forward. Just a reminder, today's webinar is going to be recorded and then posted on the center's website. We will have your lines muted. However, ask any questions that you may have in the Q&A box on the right-hand side or enter them into the chat, and we'll answer as many as we can during today's webinar, as well as those that we don't get to on the webinar itself. We'll try to answer them either directly or post responses on the website afterwards. But again, any questions that you may have, please feel free to use the Q&A box on the right-hand side. All right, so today's webinar, we're going to be talking about the Data Integration Toolkit and what it describes, which it lays out the 7 major steps that we've identified as a team related to data integration, and how the toolkit and those 7 steps can benefit your integration efforts, and how you can use the activities that we've laid out within the toolkit that align to those 7 steps, how you can use those activities to help integration activities in your state. So again, as I said, my name's Aaron Petrillo. I help lead technical assistance supports for CIID. Today you'll hear from 3 of my colleagues as well, Jeff Sellers, Tiffany Boyd, and Andrea Hall. I'll hear from them shortly. So, as I said, today we're going to talk through some of the general benefits of data integration and specifically how it relates to the toolkit and the needs that you all as state actors may have in using a resource similar to the toolkit. We'll talk overall about how to use the toolkit, its structure, and how it may be relevant to you. And then we'll dive into the actual steps and tasks, the components of the actual toolkit for you to better understand the process that we laid out within it, as well as how it may be helpful in your state. So before we jump into that, however, we're going to just kick things off with a quick poll. We want to know, what are some of the areas that you find struggling within your work related to data integration? So are there specific challenges that you have as a state or a staff articulating the use case or justifying why we need to integrate or what should be integrated before you actually start integration itself? Is there a specific project plan or difficulties that you have related to planning integration? Is it determining how to actually integrate, what needs, what system or elements should be integrated in what manner? Or are they more related to technical issues around data integration? So the actual extract, transform, and load processes or data quality checks that may impact your decisions. So take a second to fill out your poll. What do we got, Travis? Can you run that again? It looks like it ended a little early, in case folks have. I'll reopen it. All right. Yeah, just take a second to throw in your responses in there. See what we can get. These poll responses mirror several of the steps and components that we have within the toolkit. So we hope that some of these will be helpful to, well aligned to the resource that we have. So if you want to close it out, Travis, we can kind of see where we are. While we wait on that, I'll jump forward. We talked a little bit about why do we need the toolkit itself. So what we heard from many of you when CIID was originally funded, it is really, many folks didn't have a common understanding for how to actually integrate within their state. And several folks have had experience doing this in separate efforts. However, they all had a varied vocabulary and varied techniques or components that they felt were critical to integration itself. So we wanted to create a common process with easily adaptable steps or phases of an integration project that you could apply to your own state work. And we wanted to be able to articulate a more common vernacular or vocabulary for you to be able to communicate with those within your state, and also for CIID to be able to structure supports in ways that it would make more sense for you to be able to understand where in the process of data integration you are currently, and how does that relate to some of the supports and services CIID, the center, could provide itself. So the Data Integration Toolkit serves as a sample roadmap of data integration. As I said earlier, we're establishing 7 major steps of data integration, moving from our identifying and articulating why you need to integrate, what is your justification or use case for integrating, all the way through to creating documentation and communication materials for sustaining a fully integrated system, and how do you communicate that to the stakeholders within your state. We also, within the toolkit, we focused on SEA level data integration. We know there certainly are efforts within states, within districts that we want to focus, folks may be integrating some data systems, but we try to keep it at the SEA level for the purposes of simplicity and the focus area of CIID. And within this toolkit, we try to create a standard process, a process that is easy for you all to follow and use, and that focus just on the core requirements for data integration. We know that this is not going to be comprehensive. There are going to be many different components that need to be specific to you and your state's context. So we try to create as adaptable of a toolkit process as possible, so it's flexible to your needs and is relevant to you and your own state. Which is why we try to focus on the major steps and tasks within those steps rather than being directive and articulating every single component that would be required. So how is the toolkit used? Number one, we create specific activities within each major component, which we'll go through briefly as examples for how to complete a major step or a task within the step related to data integration, as well as providing estimates on how long it may take you and your colleagues to complete this activity or task, and who may be involved, trying to provide as much information on the forefront as possible so you and your colleagues know what you're getting yourselves into. In addition to that, the toolkit, we've provided some and will continue to develop supporting resources and templates related to some of the activities articulated within the toolkit, and certainly trying to pull in as many examples and samples from your peers as well. We really see this toolkit being able to be used not only as a demonstration tool for you and your colleagues to help communicate what is required for integration, help people understand the scope of an integration project, but also give you tangible tools to be able to use them. So within the toolkit itself, the way we have it organized is at the step level. These are the major components, the major 7 steps of data integration. Within each step, there are multiple tasks that would be required to complete that step. and we've developed what we're calling task templates. They're 2 to 3 page documents that are easy to understand the purpose and outcome that would come as a result of completing this task, the specific activities within that task that you would typically need to complete, and then as I mentioned earlier, the timeline, as well as staffing requirements that likely would be needed within your state. And then also trying to provide, as I again mentioned before, the lessons learned or resources that come from, or examples that come from your colleagues who have already done this work previously. So the hierarchy that's really important to remember as we move through the webinar today is we have 7 major steps, and then within those what we are calling tasks. So what needs to be completed to fully complete the step itself. So with that, we'll jump into the toolkit steps and tasks themselves. So step number 1, as we briefly discussed earlier, is focused on articulating a use case for integration. So this is, within this step, you and your colleagues will identify and document the use case, the justification for why we should be integrating. To do so, you may need the approval of state leaders within your state to ensure everyone is on the same page as to why and how you would generally be integrating. You'll more specifically define the actual scope of your project as you move into future steps, but this is really about ensuring that everyone within your state has a good understanding of why it is, what are the outcomes that would come as a result of integrating, what are the benefits, and why are we actually integrating certain systems within the state. And to talk a little bit more about this step, I'm going to go to our colleague Jeff Sellers, who worked within the Florida Department of Education and did some of this work with them as well. So, Jeff?
All right, thank you, Aaron. Again, as Aaron mentioned, I am previously used to work at the Florida Department of Education, and the integration project there, I was part of the project management leadership team, specifically around the IT aspects of the integration project. And so what I'm going to share a little bit is from that perspective within the state SCA. And so with that, state of Florida at one point had really committed to establishing a seamless education system, not necessarily education data system, but an education system as a whole, and really focused, put a high priority on student success and making sure that they were able to transition from the various levels of education within the state, from pre-K to K-12, elementary, middle, high, and even into post-secondary. And so with that, the governor, legislature, and the Commissioner of Education and the State Board of Education defined a shared vision around what that seamless education system would look like. And as a result, there was a need within the state to put together a practical, functional way to be able to follow those students as they progressed through Florida's education system. And so with that was the initiation of a P20 education data warehouse. And so with that, kind of the target was around that shared vision that legislature, governor, state leadership had defined, and wanted to really look at how well standards and curriculum were aligned across education systems, and to make sure that students were adequately equipped to successfully complete their education within the state. So that was kind of the use case, the parameters, if you will, around what Florida worked on when it came to their P20 education data warehouse. Even though the focus was specific around that shared vision that state leadership had defined, we continued to look at other uses as well as we were putting together the requirements for Florida's EDW, Education Data Warehouse. And so even though that shared vision was the driver, we continued to look beyond that during the development of it.
Thanks, Jeff. I think that pivots really well into the next step. That not only is it identifying, this first step is really focused on identifying that shared vision, but you may not necessarily have the time or bandwidth from state leaders to be able to define the exact scope of the project itself. And that certainly isn't an expectation for state leaders necessarily to take part in, but you want to make sure that you have their input in on the project early on. Step 2 is actually focused much more on defining that scope more finely. So within this step, obviously, as many of you are familiar, this includes components of defining a project team, schedules, how the team itself would operate, but also ways to determine what resources are there available to you within this effort. How will you communicate not only with state leaders, but also and escalate issues, but also for stakeholders within your state. And then in addition to that, how does this impact vendors that you currently work with, and also future contracts related to these data systems that are being integrated, and then after integration, what would this look like from a vendor relationship and contractual relationship perspective as well. So this step is really focused on establishing that structure ahead of time before diving into the core components of the project itself. So Jeff, you want to pick up where you just left off?
I'll do it. And so with that, again, just like what Aaron said, the engagement of state leadership really will enable you to move forward with the project once you have their support. So within this step, looking at establishing that project plan and structures for data integration work, for us in Florida, the way we approached that was to put together a 3-member project management team. The first member was primarily focused on the specifics and the mechanics around project management. The second focused on had an education program background, and so understood the aspects around the programs within at the education system within the state. And then the third was focus on the IT aspects and what requirements were needed when it came to information technology, and specifically that was my role as it related to the project management team. And so this 3-member team tended to drive and direct the project itself. Along with that, since there were several players who were contributing data, and players being program offices, each program office that were contributing data to be integrated into the system identified a point of contact for us, so that as we progressed through the project itself, we were able to touch base with those individuals as needed, and again, based on what was documented within the project plan. And then a third aspect when it comes to this project plan work, we felt as we were going into this project that we had the education program expertise and background collectively within the agency, but since we were developing a separate data warehouse to house the integrated data, we did not have the data warehousing expertise. So we actually engaged a vendor with that expertise to come in and help us with the development of the data warehouse. That again would be the place for the integrated data. And so once that vendor was identified, it was very important for us is a priority for us within the agency to partner with that vendor. So we actually assigned resources within the agency to work alongside with the vendor. And really this was an aspect around knowledge transfers to prepare us for once the project was over and the vendors left, that we would be able to pick this up and continue moving forward with it. So the various roles such as the data architect, database administrator, programmers, whatever the case may be, we allocated a resource to come alongside the vendor as they did the development and actually took place in part of that development as well. And so again, that played a role when it comes to assigning those resources and defining those resources as well. And again, going back to the role real quick to wrap up on step 2, going back to the role when it comes to those points of contact within the program offices, what was a benefit to them was for us to be able to let them know at what points in time we needed them to be engaged. So it wasn't that they had to be part of every discussion every time, but when it came to identifying data elements that needed to be included, or what those definitions were, or reviewing the ETL, or reviewing the results of test scenarios, all these kinds of things occurred at points through the project, and we were able to schedule that time with the various data sources, the contributors, and then engage them. And they were able to prepare and schedule for that time as well.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I think establishing a core project team is so critically important for a project as complex as this effort really is. You have so many different actors, not only those on the technical team, but also those that work every day with the 2 or more data systems that you're integrating. It becomes very complicated and process to work through if you don't have those roles clearly defined at the beginning. So moving into step 3, this step is very focused on documentation, figuring out what are the systems and elements to be integrated within this effort, and what actually do they contain, the metadata associated with them. So the code sets, definitions, the actual element names themselves. This step articulates how you identify and document all of those elements for future integration. So preparing and organizing all of the elements and systems to be integrated in future steps. And we're going to turn to my colleague, Tiffany Boyd, who worked for Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, to talk a little bit about her experiences doing this work in Wisconsin. So, Tiffany?
Great, thanks, Aaron. So when I was in Wisconsin, I was the data management and reporting team manager, and during that time I was involved in a number of integration projects. Our team was responsible for all of our major agency-wide data collections as well as the federal reporting. And when I first joined DPI, it was right after the passage of No Child Left Behind, and we were just beginning the development and implementation of our individual student record system. And I served as the technical lead for that project. And then in the last couple of years when I was at DPI, I also had a role in the development of our data warehouse. And what I'd like to talk about right now is the process of how we located and organized data elements for that individual student collection. What we did is we began by gathering all of the publicly available documentation that we had for all of our existing collections, and we would gather the data elements, any data definitions that we had, and if there were option sets applicable, we would gather that and document that as well. And then we went around and met with each of our data stewards over those collections to begin to review the documentation that we had gathered, and then also to fill in any holes that may have existed. There were a number of cases where we didn't necessarily have a published data definition at the time, and so we worked with the data steward to clearly define what that element was, and we would look to our state and our federal reporting guidance to help flesh out definitions where we needed to. We also gathered and documented information about the management of the collection, and that included like the reporting period, both the open and closed dates, but as well as any review periods that we may have, and also the state and federal reporting deadlines that were associated with that collection. And then we also brought in our IT staff who were responsible for supporting the collection and also responsible for processing the data. Because they could provide additional information about the kinds of edit checks that we were currently running on our collections, which were mostly aggregate at that time. And those checks may have been run either at the time of the collection or during the data validation. And our IT staff could also provide information about where the data was stored, what databases it was in, the type of data it was, what the field length was, and if there were any constraints that were on that database. And this was back in 2004, so it was before Common Education Data Standards was around. We couldn't use some of the tools that are now available. But what we did is we recorded all of this information in a series of spreadsheets. And then those spreadsheets were our reference and our starting point for future meetings that we had as we moved throughout the project. I was at Wisconsin for 11 years, and during that time, over several different times, we added new data sets to our individual student collection. And each time that we did that, we followed a similar process for locating and organizing our data elements, as well as all of their associated attributes.
Thanks, Tiffany. And step 3 is a really critical step in order to be able to fully understand what is able to be integrated, and clearly documenting and organizing that information is really critical. Within the toolkit itself for step 3 and this step 4, we provide a number of recommendations about what should be included in terms of that documentation, and some processes for how to actually collect and document those metadata related to the data elements and systems that you'll be integrating. Just want to remind folks, feel free to use the Q&A box on the right-hand side if you have any questions about the toolkit itself, or for any of our colleagues who are speaking as we move forward. As I was saying, the critical step, step 3, sets up step 4, which is taking that documentation and comparing across the different data elements that you would be integrating, or data systems that you would be integrating, to determine what is the master integrated data set. What is the outcome of this data integration effort? What will that look like after it is integrated? So this is really the true phase, step in the process for making that actual integration determination. Looking at elements that are redundant and making sure that they're represented appropriately within the master data element, as well as making decisions like, say, a code is MF or male-female, what that will look like after within the master data set, and what that will look like after the entire set is integrated. Those types of determinations and discussions really use the documentation created in step 3, and that activity is conducted within step 4 here. And to talk a little bit about how this is happening in states, before Andrea from within CIID, but also formerly of Kansas, is going to talk a little bit about that. So take it away, Andrea.
Thank you, Aaron. Well, when I was in Kansas, I was in the IT department, and I supervised the quality assurance technicians, our testers, and the requirements analysts, and was also very involved in our ETL testing process. And when I started working for KSCE, the data integration had already begun, and our enterprise data warehouse was already in place. So a lot of the work had already been done as far as identifying the master data elements and the master data systems. It had been a very manual process. But one thing I found was that documentation was lacking. We didn't have, I had to go through a lot of the same processes that Tiffany described earlier. Outside of the information we had in place for our KIDS system, which is the Kansas Individual Data on Students, which held our master data elements for our student records, there really weren't any data dictionaries available. So a lot of legwork had to be done in order to develop those, in order to document what our final integrated data set would look like. So fortunately, during this time, the Common Education Data Standards, or CEDS, had been introduced. So we were able to take advantage of the system, of that system, and use the data dictionary template that's available as a starting point for gathering the information that we needed. And I was also an ETL tester, so I had access to the database tables for both our source systems and our enterprise data warehouse. So identifying, the data elements was fairly easy, but it didn't help me identify the definitions for those elements to make sure that we were documenting things correctly. So, and I worked in IT, not the program area, so I really was not the right person to decide what those definitions were. So I spent a lot of time reviewing websites and going over user guides and different training documentation. But finally, I just scheduled meetings with key staff members, data stewards, data managers, sometimes the program directors, and just had conversations about the data that was integrated and, got the definitions for the elements that I didn't have that way. And this turned out to be probably the best thing I could have done, because working directly with the people who are responsible for the data made me feel comfortable that the information I was getting was accurate, but it also made them feel comfortable that we were all on the same page with what that data meant and that they were being heard. And this personal face-to-face communication between IT and a program area is extremely important, because it helps foster the collaboration that needs to occur between those program areas, which is essential if you're going to have a successful integrated project. And then once our data dictionaries were completed, we loaded those into CEDS as maps, and that gave us a central location where everybody that needed access to them could get to them. And it was also an easy place to go in and update them as things changed, because an integration process really never has an ending. It's just a continual thing. And another advantage to having them in CEDS was that we were able to access the align reports. And what those reports do is they can compare your data systems to one another to make sure that as you move forward with your integration process, you're not repeating problems you've had in the past with regards to redundant data collection and redundant reporting, or just a lack of documentation.
Thanks, Andrea. That's really helpful, and I think that's a good plug, I think, for some of the connections that we've tried to make within the toolkit related to some of the resources around Common Education Data Standards and Align tool, and the process for making those decisions and documenting those decisions within step 4. A question for you, and as Tiffany or Jeff, feel free to jump in, but who typically is the lead within that step 4 process? Is it typically program staff or IT staff? How did you do it in Kansas? Was it a shared leadership role?
I definitely believe it was a shared role. We had access to the applications that were, we developed those source applications that fed into our warehouse. But as far as, what's reported to the federal, to the feds, what's reported to others in your state, that has to be a hand-in-hand process with the program areas. They know the data. They're responsible for the data. So, you know, both sides have to have, I think, equal responsibility in that.
Got it. Great. That's really helpful. I think actually that segues really well into step 5 and the transition between step 4 and 5. This is really the handshake portion between the program and technical team. Between 4 and 5, you're really finalizing those decisions within step 4 and then really conducting the much more technical portion of step 5, which within step 5, you're implementing that ETL, as Andrea mentioned earlier, that extract, transform, and load process of actually taking the data, the previous data systems, and making the adjustments articulated within step 4, and loading, transforming that data and loading it into the newly integrated data system, which should derive that new integrated data set. So from that master integrated data set articulated in step 4. So this step 5 is really about transforming that data, moving from previously unintegrated to integrated data, and piloting and testing that process to make sure that it's migrated adequately. So Andrea, do you want to talk a little bit more about how you managed that process within Kansas and how you conducted some of the pilots or testing?
Sure. The ETL process, extraction, transfer, and load process in Kansas was used to move the source data into the data warehouse, which is where we had our integrated data, which is where the data were pulled for federal and state reporting. We updated our source systems yearly at least to address changes in federal or state reporting, and then we outlined these changes in what we called requirements document. So this document included a section for new data elements that were being introduced, as well as some that may no longer have required collection, so they were being deprecated. This was also a really good way to document the changes that were occurring in our data dictionaries so that we were able to keep them updated and accurate as things progressed. So to address the ETL requirements, we had a requirements analyst who would meet with program staff members and gather the business needs and then document those in a requirements document. And that requirements document would then be routed back to the program area after it had been drafted, just to make sure that the business needs had been accurately captured and documented. And then it was routed to the application developers and the database administrators who would use it to create their technical design documentation, their physical data models, and then they would also hold meetings with each other to make sure that any changes being considered and the elements of the data that was being collected wouldn't adversely affect any other systems that might interact with the one that was being updated. So for example, our master data system was our CIID application, and it was updated every year, but before we updated it, we would schedule meetings with every program that had a system that either interacted with that CIID system or that had some kind of a stake in that CIID system. And we did this to make sure the changes that were being considered wouldn't eliminate or somehow make ineffective a master data element that another system might rely on. And then we also routed these requirements, this requirements document, to our QA testers who used it to create their test cases. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it had been routed to developers who used it to create their physical data models, and we relied heavily on the physical data models when creating our test cases for the ETL processes. And then the document was routed to the RA supervisor and the IT director for final approval. And then once we had that approval, we would run our ETL in a test environment, and then we would test it. And if all the testing passed, then the process would be repeated again in a production environment to verify that everything was working as expected in the live environment. A really good rule of thumb is that just because it works in test does not mean it's going to work in production. And you never want to update production before you've tested it first in a test environment. It's, as much as you might try to keep your test and production environments in sync, the reality is that at some point they're going to be out of sync. So testing in both is very, very important. And then finally, I don't know if you picked up on it, I might have been talking really fast, but all of the documentation surrounding that ETL process included a traceability back to that original requirements document. So the issues log, even though I didn't discuss that, would directly reference the test case. And then your test case would trace back to your technical design document and your physical model, your physical data model. And then those would trace back to your requirements document. So when the final ETL was run and everything, considered passed as far as testing went, everybody from IT all the way back to the program area would feel confident that the ETL process produced what was planned for and agreed upon by everybody.
And I think that's a really good point, Andrea, to mention that, and I know there are a number of folks on the line here that have very limited experience in more technical field, and then those that have much less experience in the programmatic field. I think the purpose of this toolkit is really to help everyone understand the components that are required to complete each step, and as a result, integration work as a whole. And step 5 is a great example of those that may have less of a technical understanding of I hand over my requirements and the tech team does their magic, and then it comes out on the other side and we make sure that it's right. This, as Andrea and Jeff have said several times, describes enough to make me dangerous, but I may not know everything. But we really try to lay out the overall activities and requirements for completing a process like this in step 5, and helps you as the program team and you as the technical team know what are the major activities and tasks required to complete this, even though I may not have expertise across all the areas. And that's really the purpose that we try to fulfill for all of these steps. But I think this in particular is a really good example where there are definitely areas that may not be as familiar to those as others. But thanks, Andrea.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, we'll jump to step 6. And step 6 is focused on validating that ETL, that extract, transform, and load, and all the processes to make sure that you come out with the integrated data set that you intended to create. And these processes will require, just like a number of piloting and testing will be required in step 5, this validation and data quality check process may be required to be done multiple times as well. But it's really, this step is focused on ensuring that you have the outcome and output of the system that you're really looking for, articulates how to get the approval and sign off of those within your state before stamping it done, and then really documenting the process that it took to get here. So as Andrea said earlier, a number of the documents that you're creating around the piloting and testing phases within step 5, you'll build on that documentation here in step 6 to help define for those within your state how you got to this end point here, not just step 5, but all the way back to step 1. How do we go from an initial concept, documenting and organizing, ensuring, identifying that master data element, and then that actual transformation process from step 5. So turning to our colleague Tiffany here to talk a little bit about how you manage this process in Wisconsin. So
sure.
Take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Aaron. For this step, I wanted to share just a little bit from our data warehouse project of when we were first developing that. And what we did when we got to this portion of the project, when we got to the data quality review and validation, we started each time with a kickoff meeting. And at that kickoff meeting, we would go over our test plan, we'd go over the strategy, we would talk about the roles and responsibilities for each team member, timelines for our review, and then each reviewer would get a copy of, and we made sure that each reviewer had a copy of the ETL specifications and the requirements for the data warehouse tables. our data review team was comprised of a combination of data stewards and data experts, and these could be stewards or experts that were related either to the collection of the data itself or that may have been major users of the data. So even if they weren't responsible for the collection but they were a major user, they were also included in the data quality review. We also had IT staff that was supporting the data warehouse as part of this team. And whenever we had data sets that included students with disabilities, our IDA Part B data manager was part of that as well. We had multiple levels of QA. So our IT team primarily would check to make sure the total counts of records were transferred during that ETL process. They had a lot of test scripts, and each of those were saved in a folder on a shared drive, the scripts that they would run, and then they also saved the results in another folder on that shared drive. And the name of each test result included the date that it was run so that we had a historical tracking and a log. The data stewards and the data experts, on the other hand, were more responsible for the validation and the review of the content. So they were integral in developing specific test cases that included projected outcomes and what we would expect to see in our data warehouse. And then the query statements that were used to pull the data during that validation process, as well as the results, were all stored in spreadsheets, and these were stored on the same shared drive, again with dates and identifying information in the name. And then in a number of cases, we would follow records for small cohorts of students for specific scenarios to ensure that the data was integrated properly. And these were generally the more complicated kinds of scenarios where there might have been a number of different business rules. So we would even do that sort of testing as well. Often the testing would include comparing counts from our original source collection or from the source reporting tables, and then any discrepancies we found, they would be investigated. Sometimes these were just part of the cleansing process. One of the things that used to happen when we would be collecting data through our individual record system is that the same student might get assigned two different unique IDs, and during this data integration process, we were able to cleanse that and merge some of that data. So some of the discrepancies were expected, others were not, and then we would look further in terms of was it an issue with the ETL process itself or something in the script that we used to actually load the data, or it could have actually been an error for the person who was testing it in terms of how they pulled it, not knowing fully how to pull it. So all of that information, all of the results were always stored on the shared drive so that they were accessible by anyone on the project team to be able to go back to. We had an issue log where we would track any of the issues that were found. And then the development team, after we go through a round of testing, the development team would go back through. They would address those issues. They would rerun the ETL, and then we'd go through another round of data review and testing until we were all satisfied with the results then. And then at that point, then the data steward would do the sign-off. And so that was pretty much, we did that. We would, we generally worked with one set of data at a time, one topic of data at a time. And so once we finished the one topic, then we would kind of move to the next. And so it was iterative within a data topic, and then it was also iterative as we looked at specific topics throughout the process.
Thanks, Tiffany. Yes, and certainly ensuring that process is well documented for not only folks to understand what occurred for this integration effort, but also for future integration efforts that may occur within your state. Understanding and having well documented processes is critically important. And then which transitions into the final step of the toolkit focused on post-integration activities, which is, while the documentation that occurs in step 6 is more focused on internal audiences, The post-integration activities in step 7 are for both internal and external stakeholders that may need to know what are the changes in the calendar, either of collection or reporting or analysis that may now occur in this newly integrated system, or how do I access the data within the new system, and what actually changed. It's helpful to create documentation for folks to better understand what actually was integrated and what does that mean in terms of new access to data or new ability to analyze data across collections and systems. So with that, let me pass it to Jeff briefly to just talk a little bit about some of the things you did in Florida.
All right,
yeah.
Thanks, Aaron. We are in the home stretch here. So in Florida, as we were wrapping up our project, the reference here to a single calendar, we put together this calendar not only included when the data was available in the various source systems for integration, the recurring integration that occurred. It also included when changes would happen on the source sides. Annually, there were typically a schedule of when these changes came in, a lot of times driven by the state legislature. They, any kind of changes in state statutes we knew about usually by May, and then the process started on the source side. They made changes. They would communicate those changes to the education data warehouse staff, who in turn would then make those changes within the integrated data system, and then we're ready for once that data was ready for the ETL to run and to be moved, copied over into the education data warehouse. But it did require a lot of internal collaboration and coordination so that the changes were accurately communicated within the department between staff. As those changes occurred, there would be that communication of any of what those changes meant, the potential of additional capabilities of those changes introduced, and then we would move forward with that. We were always, regardless of what the specifics around these changes would be, and the ongoing support of the integrated data system, we'd always be keeping an eye out for additional uses or needs for the data. And again, that would promote the sustainability of the system, but also to increased communication about what the system could do, and also to increase reliability on the system. So with that, Aaron, I'll send it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, and I think ultimately one of the main takeaways we want you all to have from today's presentation is that data integration can be obviously a very daunting and intimidating effort to take on. However, within this toolkit, we tried to boil it down into consumable bite-sized pieces. So breaking it down into the 7 major steps, but then also within these tasks. So for example, within step 7, we have a task focused just on how do you develop that single calendar or that map of data access that Jeff talked about briefly. So if there are specific components that you hear during today's presentation that you would like to learn more about, know that it's not just in a file of a large comprehensive toolkit. We tried to break these down into accessible, consumable, bite-sized pieces as much as possible. So for that, to that end, we'd like to learn a little bit more from you all on what areas are you interested in, what toolkit component would you want to learn more about? Is it focusing much more on the front portion of the toolkit of defining that use case, that justification for why we should be integrating, planning the project itself, or what you heard from Tiffany and Andrea around determining your master data elements and documenting that the elements that you're trying to integrate, or more of the technical components that they described in steps 5 and 6 related to that ETL, or extract, transform, and load, and then the data quality checks associated with it. Or is it just a piece around post-integration activities? How do you better document and disseminate some of the ways of accessing this data and helping people understand the new capability that you have within your states? We'd love to learn a little more from you all. So if you could just take a minute to vote, that would be great. Okay. Close it out here, Travis, since we just have a couple minutes left. And the reason why we're doing this, we'd really love to know what you all are focused on. And actually, we just had a question come in related to that of if we have a specific step that we're interested in receiving technical assistance on, how do we reach out? That is a perfect question, perfectly timed. First of all, we have the toolkit is available online. We talked briefly about its overall structure, but as you can tell, there is a wealth of information contained within this toolkit in much more detail. So the first activity I would encourage you to do would be to look at the online toolkit available on the link here, and we'll distribute this after the webinar as well. Access the toolkit through this link. You'll be able to see all the major 7 steps and then individual tasks. There are 23 tasks under those 7 steps. And within them, we document, as we said before, who needs to be involved, what are some of the typical activities related with creating that single calendar, for example. How long does it typically take, who should you involve, and what are some recommended formats or individual experiences that folks have had that they can provide a lesson learned related to that. So we really encourage you to dig through it and see if there are any components that you'd like to learn more about. And if that is the case, feel free to contact us. So number one, as always, CIIDTA@aemcorp.com or CIDTA@aemcorp.com, or feel free to email myself if there is anything related to CIDTA in general that we could help with, but also certainly if there are components within the toolkit you'd like to learn more about, definitely feel free to reach out and let us know. We see this toolkit as serving 2 purposes. One, helping you better understand and organize your work within your state and your colleagues, so using this as a teaching tool to some of your own colleagues and help move your own projects forward, but definitely as a TA tool ourselves for us to be able to use in partnership with you. So sending CID staff to help facilitate a process articulated, say, in step 2 or 3, we are more than happy and would love to be able to have the opportunity to help you and your colleagues execute some of the activities that are articulated in the toolkit. So we see this as being useful to you and all as alone, as well as a partnering tool that the two of us can use together. So, and then, as always, we'd love your feedback if you have additional areas that you'd like to learn more about or feedback on today's webinar. Please use the survey link. It'll also open up after the webinar is completed. But we really want your feedback, how we can better develop resources and materials that are relevant to you and your colleagues. So please give us that feedback. We'd love to have it. You'll see the link in the chat box. We'll also be emailing it out to those participating on the webinar either today or tomorrow. You'll be getting that in your inbox itself. So with that, thank you very much for attending today's webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to email myself or the CIDTA box, and we look forward to hearing from you. So, thank you all. And of course, thanks to Tiffany, Jeff, and Andrea. Much appreciated. So, thank you.